No one dances in this room after midnight. The warning had been spoken so often at Blackthorne Hall that even the newest servants lowered their voices whenever they passed its locked doors. Yet on that winter night, with the final guests gone and the last carriage lanterns fading beyond the iron gates, Clara Bennet stood alone beneath the darkened chandeliers and listened as the great clock began to strike 12. One chime, then another. Each note moved through the abandoned ballroom like a memory unwilling to remain buried. Clara should have returned to the servants' wing. Mrs. Crawford would expect her before the candles burned low, and Lady Vanessa had already complained twice that evening about the slowness of the household staff. But Clara's hands had found the small silver key resting beside the forgotten music box, and something within her, something quiet and long-starved, refused to walk away. She turned the key. A delicate waltz trembled into the silence. The melody was old, softened by years, but Clara knew every note. Her father had played it on rainy evenings when their little parlor had seemed grander than any palace. "Stand straight," he would tell her, "not because the world is watching, but because your soul deserves dignity even when no one is." Clara closed her eyes. Her gray servant's dress brushed the polished floor as she took one careful step, then another. For the first time in years, she was not Mrs. Crawford's companion, nor the nameless young woman ordered to carry shawls and pour tea. She was simply Clara, the girl who had once believed music could open every locked door. Above her, hidden behind the carved railing of the shadowed gallery, Duke Adrian Whitmore stood perfectly still. He had entered through the western corridor after hearing the music from his study, prepared to silence whoever had broken the rule that had governed Blackthorne Hall for 7 years. Then he saw her. Candlelight caught the loose strands of her dark chestnut hair and turned them briefly to bronze. Her movements held no vanity, no practiced invitation, none of the polished calculation he had witnessed among society's most celebrated women. She danced as though the room were empty, as though no title could judge her, as though sorrow had loosened its grip for the length of a single song. Adrian's hand tightened around the gallery rail. He had not stepped inside this ballroom since Eleanor's death. Even from above, the familiar floor felt like frozen ground beneath him. Yet the young woman below moved through it without fear, breathing warmth into a place he had preserved as a monument to grief. He should have spoken. He should have ordered the music stopped. Instead, he watched. Clara turned beneath the dim chandelier, her worn shoes nearly soundless. A faint smile touched her face, fragile and private, and Adrian felt something shift behind the walls he had spent years building. Not desire. Not yet. Something more dangerous. Recognition. The melody slowed. Clara opened her eyes and looked toward the gallery, suddenly certain she was no longer alone. Adrian stepped backward before the light could reach him. By the time she searched the darkness, there was only an empty railing, a dying candle, and the echo of footsteps disappearing beyond the door. By morning, the ballroom had returned to silence, but Adrian had not. He stood at the tall window of his study while pale winter light spread across the frozen lawns of Blackthorne Hall, and for the third time in less than an hour, he found himself remembering the young woman in the gray dress. The memory irritated him because it refused to fade. He had seen hundreds of accomplished dancers in London, women trained from childhood to command a room with every turn of the wrist, yet none had unsettled him as she had. Perhaps because she had not known she was being watched. Perhaps because nothing in her expression had asked for admiration. A discreet knock sounded behind him. "Enter." Thomas Reed stepped inside, carrying the morning correspondence. He had served the Whitmore family for more than 30 years and possessed the rare ability to appear unsurprised by anything. Adrian waited until the letters were placed upon the desk. "The young woman traveling with Mrs. Crawford," he said. "What is her name?" Thomas paused only briefly. "Miss Clara Bennet, Your Grace." The name settled strangely in the room. "She is not a guest." "No, Your Grace. She serves as Mrs. Crawford's companion and personal attendant." Adrian turned from the window. "A servant who knows a private Whitmore waltz." This time, Thomas did look surprised. "Miss Bennet was in the ballroom?" "That was not my question. I do not know how she learned it." Adrian's voice remained controlled, but something colder moved beneath it. The melody Clara had chosen had not been played at Blackthorne Hall since Eleanor's final winter. It had belonged to another life, one sealed behind locked doors and covered mirrors. No outsider should have known it. "Find out," he said. Downstairs, Clara carried a breakfast tray through the eastern corridor, careful to keep her steps even. She had slept little. The footsteps above the ballroom had been real. She was certain of it. Yet no one had confronted her, and that silence frightened her more than anger might have. Lady Vanessa Caldwell sat near the drawing-room fire, dressed in pale blue silk despite the early hour. Mrs. Crawford occupied the settee opposite her, speaking of wedding arrangements as though the future of Blackthorne Hall had already been decided. Clara placed the tea beside them and lowered her gaze. "You look tired," Vanessa observed. "Did the servants' quarters prove uncomfortable?" "They were entirely suitable, my lady." "How fortunate." Some women confuse generosity with entitlement. Clara understood the warning. She answered only, "Yes, my lady." As she turned to leave, she felt it again. A presence in the doorway. Adrian stood there, one hand resting against the dark wood, his expression unreadable. His gaze passed over the room and stopped on her. Not upon Vanessa, not upon Mrs. Crawford, upon Clara. For one suspended moment, neither spoke. Then his eyes lowered to her worn shoes, the same shoes that had crossed the ballroom floor after midnight. Clara's fingers tightened around the empty tray. He knew. Adrian stepped aside to let her pass, but as she reached the doorway, his voice stopped her. "Miss Bennet." She turned slowly. "Your Grace." His face revealed nothing. "Where did you learn to dance?" Clara held the empty tray against her waist and met his gaze with a steadiness she did not feel. "My father taught me, Your Grace." The drawing-room seemed to grow quieter around the words. Lady Vanessa's cup paused halfway to its saucer. Mrs. Crawford looked sharply toward Clara, as though the answer itself had crossed some invisible boundary. Adrian remained in the doorway. "Your father was a dancing master?" "A music teacher," Clara replied. "He believed rhythm and grace belonged to everyone, not only those born into grand houses." Vanessa gave a faint laugh. How democratic of him. Clara lowered her eyes, but Adrian noticed the color rise in her cheeks. "And the waltz?" he asked. "Where did he learn that particular piece?" Clara hesitated. The melody had been part of her childhood for so long that she had never thought to question its origin. "He said it was given to him by a former pupil. I never knew her name." Something changed in Adrian's expression. Not anger. Something older. He dismissed her with a slight nod, and Clara left the room feeling that she had opened a door without knowing what waited behind it. Adrian did not join the others for breakfast. He returned instead to the western wing, where winter light lay cold across the covered portraits and silent furniture. At the end of the corridor stood the locked music room. He had carried the key for 7 years and used it only once, on the morning after Eleanor's funeral, when he had ordered the instruments covered and the doors sealed. His hand rested against the key in his pocket. Memory came without mercy. Eleanor at the piano, laughing when she missed a note. Eleanor crossing the ballroom in silver silk. Eleanor asking him to listen when he had chosen duty instead. Their final evening had begun beneath chandeliers and ended in silence. She had wanted him to leave the guests and speak with her privately. He had refused, too proud to abandon appearances, too certain there would be time later. Before midnight, she had taken the carriage alone. By dawn, Blackthorne Hall had become a house of mourning. Adrian had never forgiven the storm, the road, or himself. Yet guilt required rules, and he had built his life from them. No music after midnight. No dances. No celebrations that lasted beyond courtesy. No mention of the waltz Eleanor had loved above all others. He had preserved his grief so carefully that even the servants learned to move around it. Now a young woman in a gray dress had entered that forbidden room and made it breathe. He unlocked the music room. Dust softened the black piano. White sheets covered the chairs like sleeping ghosts. Upon the mantel stood a small portrait of Eleanor, her expression bright and impatient with life. Adrian looked at it for a long moment. "Who taught him your song?" he asked the painted face. The room offered no answer. Behind him, Thomas appeared quietly at the threshold. "Your Grace, Lady Vanessa wishes to discuss the engagement announcement." Adrian closed his eyes. The marriage had been arranged for reason, inheritance, and duty. Vanessa understood all three. She would make a suitable duchess and ask for nothing he could no longer give. That had once seemed enough. "Tell her this afternoon," he said. Thomas bowed but did not leave. "And Miss Bennet?" Adrian looked again at the covered piano. "Find everything you can about her father. By noon, Blackthorne Hall had begun preparing for Lady Vanessa's engagement supper, though no formal announcement had yet been made. Silver was polished, winter roses were carried in from the greenhouse, and servants crossed the corridors with the quiet urgency of people arranging a future that everyone considered inevitable. Clara moved among them without complaint. She had learned long ago that invisibility could be a kind of shelter. After her father's death, creditors had taken the piano first, then the books, then the narrow brick house where music had once filled every room. Mrs. Crawford had offered employment before poverty could strip away the last of Clara's choices. Since then, Clara had become skilled at folding herself into the edges of other people's lives. She remembered appointments, repaired gloves, read letters aloud, and stood 3 steps behind whenever society entered the room. No one asked what she had wanted before necessity answered for her. That afternoon, Lady Vanessa summoned her to the ballroom, where several young women were choosing flowers for the supper tables. The chandeliers remained unlit, but pale daylight poured through the tall windows, revealing every inch of the floor Clara had crossed after midnight. Her pulse quickened. Vanessa noticed. "You appear uneasy, Miss Bennet." "Only tired, my lady." One of the guests, Miss Evelyn Mercer, smiled behind her fan. "Perhaps she has been practicing for us." Vanessa's gaze sharpened with amusement. "Is that true? Mrs. Crawford tells me your father instructed you in music and dancing." Clara looked toward Mrs. Crawford, who stood near the windows and avoided her eyes. "He did." "How charming," Vanessa said. "Then show us." The request was spoken lightly, but no one mistook it for kindness. A servant stopped arranging roses. Another lowered his gaze. Clara kept her hands still at her sides. "I am here to assist Mrs. Crawford, my lady, and I am asking for assistance. The floor must be tested before tonight." Soft laughter moved through the room. Clara felt the familiar pressure to obey, to smile, to make humiliation look like gratitude. She thought of her father's voice. Grace was never submission. Dignity did not require permission. "I am certain the floor is sound," Clara said. Vanessa's smile thinned. "Are you refusing me?" "I am refusing to turn something my father loved into an entertainment meant to invite laughter." Silence followed. Clara heard the faint crackle of the fireplace and the distant ticking of the hall clock. Then a deeper voice entered the room. A reasonable refusal. Adrian stood beneath the archway. No one had heard him approach. Vanessa turned, her expression changing at once. "We were only amusing ourselves." "At Miss Bennet's expense." His tone remained calm, which made the rebuke heavier. Vanessa lifted her chin. "You defend servants rather passionately today." Adrian's eyes moved to Clara. She stood straight in her plain gray dress, her face composed despite the brightness in her eyes. He remembered her moving alone through darkness with no audience and no shame. Now, surrounded by people who possessed more wealth than kindness, she seemed even less ordinary. "I defend good judgment wherever I find it," he said. Vanessa looked away first. The guests returned awkwardly to the flowers. Clara bent to retrieve a fallen ribbon, but Adrian reached it before she did. For a brief moment, both held one end. He released it at once. "Your father taught you well," he said quietly. Clara met his gaze. "He taught me not to mistake obedience for virtue." Something almost like approval touched Adrian's face, then vanished. Across the ballroom, Vanessa watched them both, and for the first time, her confidence gave way to suspicion. After the confrontation in the ballroom, Clara expected Adrian to withdraw behind the cold formality that governed every corner of Blackthorne Hall. Instead, she began to notice him everywhere. He appeared at the far end of the breakfast room while she arranged Mrs. Crawford's correspondence. He paused beside the library doors when she knelt to help a young maid gather fallen books. Once, while Clara carried a basket of linen through the eastern corridor, she looked up and found him standing near the window, watching as though he had forgotten where he intended to go. Each time, his expression closed before she could understand it. Adrian told himself that he was observing her because of the waltz. Thomas had not yet discovered how Samuel Bennett had learned a melody known only within the Whitmore family, and caution demanded attention. Yet caution did not explain why Adrian remembered Clara giving her portion of cake to a kitchen girl who had missed supper. It did not explain why he noticed the careful stitches on Mrs. Crawford's torn shawl or knew, without asking, that Clara had repaired them. Most troubling of all, it did not explain why the hall seemed emptier whenever she was absent. 3 days after the engagement supper, snow began falling before dusk, covering the grounds in white silence. Clara finished her duties late and stopped outside the locked music room. A narrow line of golden light showed beneath the door. She should have continued toward the servants' stairs, but the sound of a single piano note held her still. The door opened. Adrian stood on the other side. "Were you listening?" he asked. "Only for a moment, Your Grace." His gaze moved to her hands. "Do you play?" "Not anymore." "That was not what I asked." Clara looked past him at the covered furniture and the black piano waiting beneath the candlelight. "Yes, I play." Adrian stepped aside. The invitation was unspoken, yet unmistakable. Clara entered slowly. The room smelled of dust, beeswax, and winter air. She approached the piano, but did not sit. "This room has been closed a long time." 7 years. His answer carried enough weight to stop further questions. Clara rested her fingertips lightly upon the polished wood. "Some rooms are closed to keep memories safe." Adrian's jaw tightened. "And some are closed because memories are not safe at all." Their eyes met. For the first time, Clara saw beyond his title and severity. She saw a man who had mistaken punishment for loyalty and silence for peace. Adrian looked away first. "Your father," he said. "What did he tell you about the waltz?" Clara searched her memory. "He said it came from a woman who feared she would be forgotten." Adrian became motionless. "Anything else?" "Only that she gave him a silver music box and asked him to preserve the melody." The candle flame trembled between them. Adrian crossed the room until only a few feet remained. His voice lowered. "Miss Bennet, the woman who loved that waltz was my wife." Clara's breath caught. The truth settled over the room like falling snow. "I did not know." "I believe you." The words were simple, but they changed something between them. Clara had spent years being doubted before she spoke. Adrian had trusted her before she offered proof. She turned toward the piano and pressed one key. The note rang softly through the sealed room. "My father used to say that music remembers what people are too frightened to say." Adrian watched her hand withdraw. "And what does this room remember?" Clara looked at the covered chairs, the dark windows, and the portrait above the mantel. Then she faced him. That grief lived here, but perhaps it was never meant to live here alone. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Clara's words remained between them, gentle but impossible to dismiss. Adrian turned toward Eleanor's portrait, where candlelight rested upon the painted curve of her smile. "She was never meant to be alone," he said quietly. "I simply did not understand that until it was too late." Clara heard the regret beneath his composure, but she did not offer easy comfort. Some griefs were too deep for borrowed assurances. Instead, she glanced toward the silver music box resting on a shelf beside the piano. "May I see it?" Adrian followed her gaze. "That is not the one your father kept." "No, but the design is nearly identical." He lifted the box and placed it in her hands. Its surface was darkened with age, yet the engraved roses along the lid remained delicate. Clara turned it carefully beneath the light. "My father's box has the same mark beneath the base. I always thought it belonged to the maker." Adrian leaned closer, though a respectful distance remained between them. Beneath the box was a small crest shaped like a thorn branch surrounding a star. His expression changed. That was Eleanor's private seal. Clara looked up. Then perhaps both boxes came from her. The following morning, Mrs. Crawford reluctantly permitted Clara to retrieve her few belongings from the servants' wing. The silver box had traveled with her for years, wrapped in an old wool scarf at the bottom of her trunk. Its tune had comforted her through cold rooms, unpaid bills, and the long silence after Samuel Bennett's death. She carried it to Adrian's study, where Thomas waited beside the fire. Adrian closed the door behind her. "You are certain your father never explained how he received it?" "He said only that a former student entrusted it to him." Clara set the box upon the desk. "He became troubled whenever I asked more." Thomas examined the seal. "There is no doubt, Your Grace. This belonged to the late Duchess." Adrian wound the key. The familiar waltz began, each note bright against the solemn room. Clara watched the mechanism turn, then noticed the melody falter at the same place it always had. "It has done that since I was a child." Thomas lifted the box and pressed gently along the wooden base. A narrow panel shifted. Clara drew a breath. Hidden beneath the mechanism was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and sealed with faded blue wax. Adrian stared at the handwriting before touching it. "That is Eleanor's hand." The room seemed to contract around them. He opened the paper slowly, as though the past might vanish if disturbed too quickly. The letter was addressed to Samuel Bennett. Eleanor thanked him for preserving the music, then wrote of documents she had discovered within the Whitmore estate accounts. Money had been moved through false charities and secret investments. She feared someone close to Adrian was using the family name for dishonest purposes. One sentence brought Adrian's reading to a halt. "If I fail to reach the attorney tomorrow, you must keep the second page safe until Adrian is ready to hear the truth." Adrian searched the hidden compartment, but it was empty. "There is no second page," Thomas said. Clara remembered her father burning old papers during his final winter, his face pale in the firelight. Perhaps he hid it elsewhere. Adrian read the letter again, his calm giving way to something colder than anger. At the bottom, Eleanor had written one final warning. "Do not trust any agreement bearing the Caldwell name." Outside the study, unseen by those within, Lady Vanessa stood motionless beside the half-opened door. Lady Vanessa stepped away from the study door before anyone inside could discover her. By the time Adrian emerged, she was seated in the morning room with perfect composure, discussing flowers with Mrs. Crawford as though nothing in the world had shifted. Yet beneath her calm expression, fear had begun to move. The Caldwell name had appeared in Eleanor's letter, and Clara Bennett now possessed the only object that might uncover why. Vanessa understood that truth did not need to be complete to become dangerous. It needed only to be believed. That evening, Blackthorne Hall filled with guests invited for the delayed engagement announcement. Candles burned beneath the chandeliers, musicians tuned their instruments, and laughter drifted through rooms that had forgotten celebration. Clara remained near Mrs. Crawford, dressed in her plain gray gown, while Adrian spoke quietly with Thomas beside the library doors. They had decided to examine Samuel Bennett's remaining papers the following morning. Until then, the music box would stay locked in Adrian's study. At least, that was what Clara believed. Shortly before supper, Vanessa approached her with unusual gentleness. "Mrs. Crawford requires her blue shawl," she said. "It was left in your room." Clara hesitated. "I placed it in her dressing chamber this afternoon." "Then perhaps you should make certain." Vanessa's smile did not reach her eyes. Clara obeyed because refusal would only attract attention. When she returned, the ballroom had grown silent. Guests stood in a wide circle. At its center, Vanessa held the silver music box. Clara stopped beneath the archway. "There she is," Vanessa said. "Perhaps Miss Bennett can explain why a treasured possession of the late Duchess was found hidden in her trunk." Murmurs spread across the room. Mrs. Crawford stared at Clara in horror. "Tell them this is a mistake." "The box belonged to my father," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "His Grace knows this." Every face turned toward Adrian. He stood near the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Vanessa lifted the folded letter, and this was concealed inside it. "A servant arrives, enters forbidden rooms, gains the Duke's confidence, and then produces a convenient accusation against my family. Are we expected to call that innocence?" Clara looked only at Adrian. She did not need him to solve the mystery in that moment. She needed him to speak the truth he already knew. But Adrian's gaze moved from the letter to Vanessa, then to the watching guests. He was thinking of evidence, reputation, and the second missing page. His silence lasted only seconds. To Clara, it felt like years. "Miss Bennett," he began, "until we understand how the box came into your possession, something inside her closed. You already know how." Her words were quiet, yet the entire room heard them. Adrian took one step forward. "Clara, listen to me." It was the first time he had spoken her name, but it came too late. She removed the white apron tied over her dress and laid it carefully upon a chair. Mrs. Crawford whispered her name in warning. Clara did not look away from Adrian. "I can endure being invisible, Your Grace. I have done so most of my life. But I will not remain where my honesty is treated as a question for polite society to debate. That is not what I intended. Intentions are a poor shelter." Outside, wind pressed snow against the tall windows. Clara turned and crossed the ballroom while the guests parted before her. No one laughed now. At the doorway, Adrian called after her, but pride, hurt, and years of practiced restraint carried her onward. By the time he reached the front steps, Clara had disappeared beyond the gates into the gathering storm, leaving only a line of footprints that the snow was already beginning to erase. Adrian stood upon the front steps until the last trace of Clara's footprints vanished beneath the falling snow. Behind him, the ballroom remained silent, filled with guests who had witnessed his hesitation and mistaken it for judgment. He turned back into the hall with a stillness more severe than anger. "No one leaves," he said. Vanessa's face lost its color. Thomas closed the doors while Adrian crossed to the chair where Clara had placed her apron. He lifted it carefully, as though the plain white cloth carried more dignity than every jeweled guest in the room. "The engagement announcement will not take place tonight," he said. Vanessa stepped forward. "Adrian, surely you will not allow a servant's performance to embarrass both our families. You have misunderstood the source of the embarrassment." His gaze settled upon the music box in her hands. "That object was locked inside my study. How did you obtain it?" Vanessa's composure faltered. "The door was open." It was not. The room seemed to draw inward. Thomas approached the box and examined the narrow compartment beneath the mechanism. His fingers pressed along the inner edge until a second panel released with a soft click. A smaller fold of paper slipped onto the table. Adrian recognized Eleanor's handwriting before Thomas opened it. The missing page named Charles Caldwell, Vanessa's father, and described false accounts concealed beneath the Whitmore seal. Eleanor had planned to expose them the morning after the final ball. Samuel Bennett had been asked to preserve the evidence because he was one of the few men she trusted beyond the estate. Vanessa's voice became thin. "My father is dead. He cannot answer such accusations." "No," Adrian replied. "But the records can." Thomas confirmed that several account numbers in the letter-matched ledgers still stored in the Western Archive. Adrian faced the assembled guests. "For 7 years, I allowed grief to protect a lie because truth required more courage than mourning. That failure ends tonight." He ordered the documents secured and announced that the Caldwell Agreement would be investigated openly, regardless of the damage to the Whitmore name. Vanessa removed her engagement ring with trembling fingers and placed it upon the table. Adrian did not look at it. He was already moving toward the doors. Thomas followed. "The road is nearly covered, Your Grace." "Then prepare my horse." Clara had walked almost 2 miles before a farm wagon carried her to the abandoned station near the southern road. No trains were expected until morning. She sat beneath the narrow shelter with her small case beside her, watching snow gather along the tracks. When hoofbeats sounded beyond the darkness, she rose, uncertain whether to flee or remain. Adrian appeared through the storm, his black coat white at the shoulders, his breathing unsteady from the ride. He stopped several feet away. "The second page was found," he said. "Your father protected Eleanor's truth. Vanessa placed the box in your room." Clara's eyes closed briefly, but relief did not erase the wound between them. "Then my name is clear. Before every person in that ballroom." Adrian stepped closer, then stopped when she stiffened. "I ended the engagement. That does not change what happened." "No." His answer came without defense. "I saw you when no one else did, and still, when it mattered, I allowed the room to speak before I did." Clara looked at him through the falling snow. "You watched me for weeks." Her voice remained quiet. "But when I needed to be seen, you looked down." Adrian accepted the words as he had once refused to accept truth. "I did." He removed his coat and placed it over the bench beside her rather than around her shoulders. The choice remained hers. "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am asking you not to leave believing that my silence was your shame. It was mine." Clara studied him, this powerful man standing without command or title between them. At last, she sat again. After a moment, Adrian sat at the opposite end of the bench. Snow covered the empty tracks while dawn waited somewhere beyond the dark horizon, and neither of them pretended that truth had repaired everything. But for the first time, Adrian did not hide from what his silence had cost. 3 weeks passed before Clara returned to Blackthorne Hall. She did not return as Mrs. Crawford's attendant, and she did not enter through the servant's door. Adrian had written only once. The letter contained no plea, no command, and no promise he had not yet earned. He told her that Samuel Bennett's name had been cleared, that the stolen funds were being restored to the families they had harmed, and that Blackthorne Hall would open its ballroom for a gathering held in her father's honor. At the bottom, he had written one final sentence. "You owe me nothing, but the truth deserves to be witnessed by the woman who preserved it." Clara arrived beneath a pale evening sky. Thomas greeted her at the front entrance and bowed with the respect once reserved for titled guests. The gray servant's dress was gone. She wore a simple gown of deep green, purchased with the modest inheritance recovered from her father's records. There were no jewels at her throat. She needed none. Inside, the ballroom shone with hundreds of candles. The covered mirrors had been uncovered, the dust removed, and the musicians played Samuel Bennett's arrangements beneath a garland bearing his name. Guests who had once watched Clara walk away in silence now stepped aside as she entered. Some lowered their eyes. Others offered apologies too polished to carry much weight. Clara accepted none and rejected none. She had not come for them. Adrian stood at the opposite end of the room. For a moment, he did not move. He wore the formal black coat expected of his rank, yet without Vanessa beside him, without duty disguised as destiny, he appeared less like a duke receiving society and more like a man waiting to learn whether hope would cross the floor. Thomas announced that the investigation had confirmed Eleanor's letter and Samuel's courage. Adrian then spoke before everyone. He did not soften his failure. He admitted that Clara had told the truth while he had protected appearances with hesitation. He restored her father's reputation publicly and established a music school in Samuel Bennett's name for children whose families could not afford instruction. When he finished, no applause came at first. The honesty was too quiet for celebration. Then Clara placed her hands together. The room followed. The musicians began the familiar waltz. Adrian crossed the ballroom toward her, every step measured, every gaze upon him. He stopped before Clara and bowed. "The first time I saw you dance," he said, "you believed no one was watching." Clara held his eyes. "I remember. I watched because you made a dead room feel alive. But I mistook seeing you for understanding you." He extended his hand, leaving space between them. "Tonight, I ask permission to stand beside you. Nothing more than you freely choose to give." Clara looked at his waiting hand. Once, powerful people had expected obedience from her and called it gratitude. Adrian offered choice and accepted the possibility of refusal. That difference mattered. She placed her hand in his. They moved onto the floor as the waltz rose around them. Adrian did not lead with force, and Clara did not follow from duty. They listened. They adjusted. They learned the rhythm together. Eleanor's portrait remained above the mantel, no longer veiled, while Samuel's melody filled the room he had unknowingly helped restore. When the final note faded, Adrian did not ask Clara to become his duchess. Not yet. He asked whether she would remain for spring and help establish the school. Clara smiled, not because every wound had disappeared, but because neither of them was hiding from the work of healing. "Until spring," she said. Adrian's rare smile answered hers. Some hearts do not awaken when beauty enters a room. They awaken when dignity moves through the darkness, certain it stands alone, and is finally met by someone brave enough to see it clearly.